And then if we're looking at how this pie is going to split up, who do you think is going to garner more targets? Devonta Smith, Dallas Goedert, and DeAndre Swift, or Brock Wright, Jameer Gibbs, Jamison Williams, and Marvin Jones? I mean, there's a huge disparity in target
You cherry
competition.
picked that so bad because you started it with Brock
I know.
Wright. When you know there's so many better players on the Lions. What's your problem,
Right. Yes.
Kluge?
Sam Laporta, of course. How could I leave him out?
Oh man, they're gonna drag you in the comments. Anyways, today we are diving into wide receiver rankings and tiers for fantasy football in 2023. And we're not going to waste any time. Dave Kluge, it feels like it is just pretty obvious who the top wide receivers are. You've said it numerous times. The wide receiver position is getting easier and easier to predict and to chart and project and any other words that you want to use for this. So we take a look at the top tier wide receivers: Justin Jefferson, Cooper Kupp, Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill. At the top, I think it's pretty unanimous. Justin Jefferson is there. We have not seen a wide receiver repeat as the wide receiver one since Antonio Brown did it in 2016, 2017. Where do you stand on Justin Jefferson? Do you think that he can do it? Can he be the next guy to repeat as the wide receiver one overall?
Well, we just had Graham Barfield on our show a few days ago, and he said that he kind of sees all of these guys with very similar paths to finishing as the wide receiver one. And that's what it comes down to for me. I mean, finishing as a wide receiver one is really, really hard to do in back-to-back years. And Cooper Kupp technically was the per game wide receiver one last year. So if I had to put my chips on anybody to finish as the wide receiver one, he might be the guy. But then also you look at Jamar Chase, who's on a very similar trajectory career-wise to Justin Jefferson and is a year younger than Justin Jefferson and could have that record-setting year this year like we saw from Justin Jefferson last year. But then you look at Tyreek Hill, first year on a new offense, and he put up over 20 fantasy points per game. So it's really tough to say that Justin Jefferson is undoubtedly the wide receiver one and should be drafted as the wide receiver one. But at the end of the day, he's still just 24 years old. He's coming off an 1,800-yard season. He has very little target competition. He's on a team where he is the unquestioned wide receiver one, on a team with a very bad defense, and on a team with a quarterback that he's been playing with for a few years now that seems to have pretty good chemistry. So I prefer picking at picks 2, 3, or 4, actually, because I don't think that there is a huge gap between these four players.
Because you get the best of the rest. You don't have to go out on a limb and plant your flag on someone early, and you can basically get what could be all the same value in the top four picks.
Exactly. And then you're getting better value with your second round pick as well. So if you're asking me my favorite spot to pick this year, I'd say 3, because that's typically where I end up getting Cooper Kupp, and then you're still getting a better pick in round 2. But I don't think you can go wrong with any of these guys. So if the question is, do I expect him to finish as the wide receiver one? It's no, because, he probably has a less than 25% chance to do so. But if the question is, am I still happy drafting him as the wide receiver one? Yes, of course. It's hard not to.
Yeah, I think when you start to draft guys early like this, I mean, you draft them obviously because you know what their ceiling is too, but you're also drafting them more so because you get that sense of comfort as a drafter, right? You know what their floor is, and I think with all these guys, the ceilings might be about the same. Obviously, a wide receiver one, the floors I think change a little bit, and they're a little bit different. And for me, if I'm looking at who might be that wide receiver one, I think it might swing. That pendulum might just swing right back over to Cooper Kupp because of just how freaking good he has been when he is playing, man. I talked about this in the last episode that the Cooper Kupp thing this year reminds me a little bit of the Christian McCaffrey thing last year, where people were avoiding drafting Christian McCaffrey early because of the injury stuff and saying he shouldn't be the running back one because of injuries. And now it feels like that's happening again here with Cooper Kupp. He, as you mentioned, Dave, he led all wide receivers in points per game last year. But then on top of that, like we talk about that comfort, that consistency that fantasy managers want. He's been a top 12 fantasy wide receiver in 77% of his games over the last 3 seasons. That is absolutely crazy. Okay. It's best amongst all wide receivers. And he's been a top 24 wide receiver in 93% of those games, which is also best. So, I mean, this might also be arguably the least target competition he has had on that Rams offense. And Dave, you had a really fun stat last episode talking about Cooper Kupp. You remember what that was?
Yeah, it was that Cooper Cup has scored, well, there are a few, but Cooper Cup has scored 30 plus points in 32% of his outings dating back to 2021. But the other stat that really jumped out to me is dating back to 2021, Cooper Cup has scored double digit fantasy points or better in every single outing. Now, I'm not going to say that you shouldn't draft Justin Jefferson because of this, but look at Justin Jefferson's 2022 game log, and there are some weird moments in there. You look at that game
Yeah.
against Green Bay when he had one catch for 15 scoreless yards. You look at the game against Detroit when Jeff Okuda shut him down and he had three catches for 14 yards. He had a handful of games against Philadelphia, the Jets, the Cowboys, and Chicago where he was held to under 50 yards. So it is kind of weird that a player as good as Justin Jefferson, a guy that can go for 250 yards and three touchdowns on any given week against any given team, can just be completely blanked from random games where Cooper Cup, you're never getting that. Like you're getting a 10-point floor every single week and a 35-point ceiling.
Yeah, and what I would say here for the audience, right, is like, don't hear what we're not saying. We're not going out here and saying that Justin Jefferson's a big risk and Cooper Cup is way safer. No, okay, and like to an extent, there's going to be guys that no matter how you frame it, they could be a little bit safer than the other one. But all four of these wide receivers that are in tier one all have potential to be the wide receiver one overall this year. Now, but Dave, I want to ask you something here because we have that cutoff for tier one, right? It's Justin Jefferson, Cooper Cup, Jamar Chase, and Tyreek Hill. Is there a wide receiver that's been left out of this that you think could or should be part of this tier one right now?
There's 2 guys, I think, and
Oh,
both of them
okay.
have realistic reason to be in tier 2 or wherever you have them outside of tier 1, but there's 2 guys that I think that we can look back at the end of the 2023 season and say, "Why didn't we have these guys ranked higher?" And the first guy is CeeDee Lamb, who looked great last year, had 17.7 fantasy points per game, pulled 9.2 targets per game, and now he should see some softer coverage with a healthy Michael Gallup and Brandon Cooks in the fold as well. So I think the top 4 is pretty clear cut. You can almost argue that these 2 guys I want to talk about are kind of in tier 2 by themselves, and my rankings are a little bit different than the consensus rankings. But the other guys of mine are St. Brown, another guy that we talked about last week, or not last week, but a few days ago with Graham Barfield, who just has a sky high floor. I mean, just a lock for basically a minimum 9 targets every single week. And if he's able to
He's the Sippy Cup,
sippy cup,
right?
exactly, sippy
Sippy
cup.
Cup. We got to keep this nickname going. Sippy
I
Cup.
don't want to because there might come a day where I cross paths with Amon St. Brown and I don't want to get punched in the mouth. So I'll let you stick with the Sippy Cup
That's
nickname,
fine.
but
I'll take the
it is a
hit.
good one. It is a good one. But that's the thing is right now we know that Amon St. Brown has a sky high floor with his usage. But if he's able to take that step forward and start winning routes downfield, then he untaps the ceiling, just like we saw from Cooper Cup in 2021 and onward. So those are the 2 guys, CeeDee Lamb and Amon St. Brown, that are outside of the top 4. But I think we can look back at in a few months and say, we were wrong on those guys. Maybe we should have had them a little bit higher.
By the way, quick plug. You mentioned CD Lamb there. Okay. I want to plug a great article by our very own Jeff Bell over on footballguys.com, where he lays out the argument as to how CD Lamb actually has a path to being the wide receiver one, not just in tier one, but the wide receiver one overall. And it's actually some pretty compelling stuff.
And the other thing I'll
Now,
say about
Dave,
CeeDee Lamb real quickly is that like
yeah,
we have just expected excellence right out the gate. Like if we see these wide receivers and we saw what Justin Jefferson did as a rookie, we saw what Jamar Chase did as a rookie. It's okay to be a little bit patient. You know, maybe CeeDee Lamb didn't do it right out the gate. Maybe year 2 was a little quiet as well, but now he is, an established veteran and he is one of the best wide receivers in the league. And I think because we didn't see that immediate production as a rookie, people are still just kind of have this bad taste in their mouth with Lamb for whatever reason, but he is just as good as almost any receiver in the league.
yeah, I really like the two guys that you're putting up into tier one. But I think that the guy that I'm about to say here, there's a big difference, and it's that he has an elite quarterback. And yes, Cowboys fans, just tear me to shreds in the comments, in the mentions, whatever. Dak has not shown that he is an elite quarterback yet. The guy I'm talking about is Stephon Diggs. And Stephon Diggs has been producing for years and years and years. And Dave, I know like you might be a little bit worried about him because you're an ageist and you don't like as people get older. And oh no, these wide receivers are getting close to our actual age. They're ready to turn into dust. But Stephon Diggs has still been really, really good. 28% target share over the last 3 years. Like, this is a guy that continues to command the ball. And one thing that I always like to point out is these guys like Diggs and DeAndre Hopkins and Keenan Allen, these players that are top tier route runners, getting a little bit older doesn't affect them as much as it does the guys like Tyreek Hill that win with just sheer athleticism. And something I wanted to point out here, after Cooper Kupp, Stephon Diggs has the second most games as a top 24 wide receiver over the last 3 seasons and sixth most games as a top 12 wide receiver. So if we're talking about just his production over the last 3 years, consistency, the ceiling with an elite quarterback, and honestly, there's the way I'm looking at it is he's a reliable target for an elite quarterback on a roster that I think arguably still has a lot of inconsistent weapons. A rookie tight end, a second year potentially breakout running back that might play in the slot, all that fun fantasy football jargon. Gabe Davis, who is the epitome of inconsistency. So yeah, I mean, and I'm a Khalil Shakir stan as well. So, but yeah, to me, Stephon Diggs is still that guy that should be up there in tier one. Now, before we move on and get to tier number 2, if you've been enjoying this discussion so far, please take a moment, like this video, subscribe to the channel. We're going to be bringing you 2 episodes a week during the preseason. And as we get to that regular season, we're going to be giving you 5 episodes a week. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of the episodes. And don't forget, drop your questions in the comments below, and we will personally get back to them and make sure that, we're keeping it active here with the audience. Now, Dave, before we go on to tier number 2, all right, I just want to remind everybody, we've got a great set of rankings. The rankings that we're talking about right here, filled with tiers. You can customize them, put them to your liking, put them to the exact scoring settings for your league. Head on over to footballguys.com, and with an elite subscription for just $5.79 a month, we're going to save the economy by putting money into fantasy football. You can take a look at all these rankings, and you know what? And it's not your typical rankings that you're seeing in most places. You're going to see things that give you upside downside meter. You're getting a good explanation as to why each of these players are ranked where they are. And I think it's going to allow you to go even a little bit more in depth than what this episode alone will do. So head on over to footballguys.com. You can check out the link in the description.
And the nice thing too is you can select the experts who you want going into that data set. So if you're watching the show and say, man, that Dave Kluge guy is an idiot, I do not want his advice,
He
just
is.
pull me out of the data set. If you feel the same way about Alfredo, pull him out of the data set. You pick the
Don't
football
do
guys
that.
that you like, and then you get the consensus rankings tied to our projections customized for your league. I know we're going to keep gushing about this all season. It was like the biggest thing that we did this offseason, and we just want you guys to make sure that you're using it because it is a phenomenal tool.
All right, so let's take a look at tier number 2. It has a couple names we've already mentioned. At wide receiver 5, it's Stephon Diggs. 6, CeeDee Lamb. 7, AJ Brown. 8, Amon-Ra St. Brown, both my cousins. And at 9, Devontae Adams. So this is interesting because, I mentioned earlier, Diggs is getting a little bit older. Devontae Adams is another guy that's getting a little bit older. Dave, I know that you are not a fan of wide receivers. Like, you kind of have like the Leonardo DiCaprio rule. Once they hit 28, it is over. Dude, so like, how do you feel about these guys? Is the age concerning you at all with Diggs, Devontae Adams? Because these guys are still, I mean, we'll use the term a little loosely, elite route runners and elite wide receivers. Does the age bother you?
It does bother me a little bit. We see it like when the end comes for a wide receiver, it is aggressive and it's hard to predict, but it always comes around the same time, like age 30, 31, 32. That's when we see these guys trend down. I mean, look at Julio Jones. When he was with the Titans, we were drafting him in the 3rd, 4th round, and he was terrible. And then the next year he signed with Tampa, and we said, well, assuredly he'll bounce back now that he's playing with Tom Brady. We drafted him in the 6th round. He was terrible, and he was out of the league the very next year. I mean, it happens so quickly with NFL players. So we've gotten a little bit smarter about this, and we know how these age curves work now. And a lot of the other guys that are in this same age, and I'll throw Cooper Kupp in there as well. I mean, he has been great, but would it surprise you all that much if Cooper Kupp is just not that great this year? And you said, well, yeah, he's 31 coming off an injury. Of course that was going to happen. And we use our hindsight analysis to look at that. But all these other guys, that are getting up there in the same age as Cooper Kupp and Stephon Diggs and Devontae Adams. And of course, I'm talking about Keenan Allen, DeAndre Hopkins, Tyler Lockett, Mike Evans. these guys are coming with significant discounts. You're getting them in the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh round as far as Mike Evans. And Diggs and Adams and Cup are still going in the first, maybe early second if you're lucky. And that's just what scares me is you're not getting the same age discount on these guys as you are on so many other, historical alpha wide receiver ones in fantasy. So for me, it's
So
just
can
been
I
a game
combat you
theory
on
more
one
than anything
thing?
else. Yeah.
Can I so to combat you on one thing, right? Like some of these guys you mentioned, Mike Evans, Julio Jones, and so many of these wide receivers. The problem is that they have won with their athleticism, being able to go up and over defenders, be able to run past them, and obviously, naturally, the body's going to break down. But something that I once again I like to always point it out is the route runners. They win in a different way. Is that how much does that factor into this when you start to see a guy like a Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, Cooper Cup? That I mean, Cooper Cup's a little different because he is coming off injury and he is a bit older. But let's look at Adams and Diggs here, right? Like, does that not factor in there? Is that these guys can win in a different way? They're not beating people all the time with speed. They're not going over the top as often, despite them getting downfield targets. It's the route running that helps them win.
I'd push back on that a little bit because Tyler Lockett, I mean, he's not a guy that's winning with speed and catch point abilities. I mean, he's a technician as a route runner and he's still getting pushed down there. Granted, his boomer bust tendencies, that's probably the additional baggage there that's impacting his ADP. But are DeAndre Hopkins and Devontae Adams really that different of players? I mean, they're similar in their archetypes. Sure, you could argue that Devontae Adams is a bit better at getting separation, but they're both violent route runners. They both take contact here and there, but they're both very aggressive at the catch point as well. So uh, I don't know. I mean, and I think Evans, if you look at the archetypes of these players, Evans is probably the one that is most likely to just completely fall off
Yeah,
because the size and the speed, those aren't things that you can really do at 31 that you could do at 24 and 25 years old. But I don't know if I completely agree with that because Keenan Allen and DeAndre Hopkins, Tyler Lockett are still technicians as route runners, and they win by creating a lot of separation there. I don't know. And for me, it's just more of a game theory standpoint than anything else. Is
yeah.
that
It sounds more like you want to get out before the fall comes, right?
right? I'd rather invest if one of these guys is going to bust because of their age, I'd rather it be my fourth or my fifth round pick than my first round pick.
Yeah, and I think that to continue on with the game theory talk, there, it's almost like if you are drafting a guy like Devonte Adams in the second round, who I mean, I like Adams and I think he'll still be good for fantasy this year, but you also have to consider is how much are you really gaining from that pick? If you draft him as the wide receiver 9, right? Like that's where his ADP is, I believe, right now. What's the likelihood of him finishing as a top 5 wide receiver, top 6, 7, or whatever it is, right? Like that's kind of what's the return on investment there. And so I can understand that. I don't think I'm quite ready to give up on some of these guys just because the talent is still there and the way that they
So
win.
let's also,
I
quarterback concerns are something that we hear a lot about with some of
Yeah,
these guys. Am I crazy for like liking Ryan Tannehill more than Jimmy Garoppolo?
I mean you're a little crazy for liking Ryan Tannehill in the first place, but
But more than Jimmy
um,
Garoppolo is what I'm saying.
you know what? No, I don't think you're crazy for that. I do think that Ryan Tannehill is going to provide a consistent, what do I want to call it? A consistent target volume for DeAndre Hopkins because that's what Tannehill has loved to do, right? Is sort of hit guys who can win on short, easy routes, the slot. Like that's where he made his money with Jarvis Landry and all of his early years with the Miami Dolphins and hitting those slot receivers, and that's why he also favors the tight ends, like last year with Chico Conquo. So um, I don't necessarily see it as it's hard to say like that. Ryan Tannehill's better than Jimmy G, but I think they're both kind of good enough. What I will say with this with Jimmy Garoppolo is we have not seen the actual version of him. We have seen the San Francisco 49ers
Right.
version of Jimmy G. Like we've never seen what he looks like. I mean,
So the Bill Belichick
momentarily
version
with the
for
Patriots.
briefly.
Right. Yeah, like just go out there and be a Brady clone. So I think we're going to see him maybe loosen up and rip a couple balls. Like I don't know that he's actually going to be throwing deep like that, but I can't imagine that Josh McDaniels looks at the offense that he had last year and he's like, oof, we got to get rid of that explosive plays. That seems stupid. Let's make sure that we're tossing this at 3 yards a pop with Jimmy G. I feel like there's got to be something more there. kind of like he was just stuck being a product of his environment right there in San Francisco with these yak heavy wide receivers and a hyper targeted tight end. Like Devontae Adams could absolutely be the hyper targeted guy there in Las Vegas.
What you're
So
saying makes so much sense, but I think the biggest flaw in your logic is expecting Josh McDaniels to do the right thing.
there's that's fair. I was about to say there's no flaw in my logic, but then you said there's a flaw in someone else's logic.
Yeah,
So
the flaw in your
I'm willing
logic
to go.
is expecting somebody else to do the right thing.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. So let's finish up this tier number 2 here. Like I mentioned, we've got, let me just recap: Stephon Diggs, CeeDee Lamb, AJ Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Devontae Adams, and then to close this off, Garrett Wilson and Jalen Waddle. Now, there's a couple guys that I mentioned there. We already talked about Amon-Ra St. Brown, but AJ Brown is another guy who has just such a different profile from Amon-Ra. And you already told me you're very high on Amon-Ra St. Brown. Does the different profile, does that make you kind of differentiate the way you're ranking these guys or the expectations, especially given the surroundings for AJ Brown? You have Amon Ra ranked ahead of AJ Brown, correct?
I do. And if you look at these guys, you kind of look at like the high end range of outcomes, the ceiling that we talk about chasing all the time. I think we saw AJ Brown's ceiling last year, and it was great and it was beautiful. But expecting him to just like consistently score from 60 yards out, like week after week after week, that's tough. And if anybody can do it, it's AJ Brown because he is just a freak of nature. He's so fast and he likes to get away with push offs. I'm just going to say it. He's really good at just making it look natural, but he
Man,
does it.
it's going to be a bloodbath in the comments, Kluge. What are you
I'm just
doing,
saying,
man?
there's a lot of times where AJ Brown catches the ball and he's got a defender at his ankles already. All I'm saying. But if everything goes right for AJ Brown, we know what it's going to
Dislike
look like.
button.
If everything goes right for Amon-Ra St. Brown, we haven't seen that yet. So looking at the floors for these guys, I think you can argue that Amon-Ra St. Brown actually has the safer floor because of his target volume and because of his lack of competition and because of the ecosystem he's in where this Lions team is throwing the ball a ton. So for me, I see two very similar ceilings if everything works out well, and I see a slightly higher floor for Amon-Ra St. Brown. So I have actually been drafting Amon-Ra St. Brown ahead of AJ Brown for the last few weeks now, and it's a spicy, spicy take. I know it, but it just makes sense to me.
It's not that spicy. I'm there with you. I'm there with you because I do think that we have seen the ceiling for AJ Brown, whereas I don't think we've seen the ceiling yet for Amon-Ra St. Brown. And I think that, like I've said, Charizard season, like I think this is when it happens.
So first of
Now,
all,
before we head
there's
on
more
over to,
volume to go
yeah,
around in Detroit than there is in Philadelphia. And then if we're looking at how this pie is going to split up, who do you think is going to garner more targets? Devonta Smith, Dallas Goddard, and DeAndre Swift, or Brock Wright, Jameer Gibbs, Jamison Williams, and Marvin Jones? I mean, there's a huge disparity in target
you cherry
competition.
picked that so bad because you started it with Brock
I know.
Wright when you know there's so many better players on the Lions. What's your problem,
Right. Yeah.
Kluge?
Sam Laporta, of course. How could I leave him out?
Oh man, they're gonna drag you in the comments. Anyways, before we get on over to tier number 3, I want to let you guys know we have got a major giveaway for all of our audience members, whether you're here on video or listening. We're giving you a chance to go head to head against us in the all new Football Guys Fantasy Show Listener League. All you have to do, leave a review, preferably 5 stars. All right, you can be honest. Tell us what you like and dislike about the show. Even if you dislike stuff, you're more likely to get in the league if you leave a 5-star review. Just saying. All right. Send that on over to Kluge at footballguys.com. Okay. Screenshot that and send it to KLUGE at footballguys.com. And you'll be entered for a chance to be in the listener league with the two of us. Now, Dave, we've got our tier number 3, and this is where you see a lot of the up and comers, a lot of the quote elite wide receiver 2s, which that's an oxymoron. It's jumbo shrimp here in the tier 3. But we're looking at T. Higgins, Chris Olave, Devontae Smith, DK Metcalf. All right, I'm going to stop right there. We'll keep going with a few more. But I look at these guys, Waddle, Higgins, Metcalf, Devontae Smith. These guys all have a lot of target competition. Whereas Garrett Wilson, who we didn't mention, who was up in tier 2, according to Football Guys. And once again, these are not our rankings and our tiers. We are looking at the overall consensus rankings over on Football Guys. But Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave do not have that crazy target competition. How much does the target competition factor into your rankings?
Well, this time of year, when it is July or August, and we're looking at projections and we're looking at outcomes for the season, The beautiful thing is we expect everybody to play 17 games and everybody's going to be healthy and it's going to be really easy to divide that pie up.
What a time to be alive.
Alfredo, do you think every single player that we're talking about today is going to play 17 games?
Dude, I'm just thinking about pie now that you mentioned it, but no, it's I wish everybody would stay healthy.
So I think that's the biggest thing for me is that right now in this time of year, we're looking at the projected value and the projected workload and targets and all these things. But what happens if Tyreek Hill gets hurt? What happens if Jamar Chase, Tyler
Don't
Lockett,
don't
AJ Brown? I'm just
what are
saying
you doing?
there
What are you doing,
there
man?
is
The
untapped.
Dolphins just lost Jalen Ramsey, and you're trying to take Tyreek Hill away from me as well. Stop it. Stop it,
What
David.
I'm saying is these elite wide receiver twos that we're talking about have contingent upside that we don't want to happen,
Right.
but can happen. So, of course, right now when you start looking at the projections, Chris Olave looks like he is going to see more targets than these other guys that we're talking about. But there's a world where some of these other guys get hurt, and then Jalen Waddle and T. Higgins and DK Metcalf and Devonta Smith are all of a sudden, weekly top 5 receivers. So I am willing to just bet on the talent, knowing the situations change and players get hurt and things could happen. And I like Chris Olave a lot, but I see Devonta Smith just as an overall better wide receiver. And I see DK Metcalf as an overall better wide receiver. DK Metcalf's a little bit different because he needs 2 injuries for him to be that uncontested,
Yeah.
top 5 guy. But I do prefer Devonta Smith over Olave for that reason, just because of the possible contingent upside.
So I'll say this, at least when comparing these guys, and particularly why I have Olave ranked ahead of all these players that we're mentioning, and Garrett Wilson included. Uh, Talent develops, right? Like we're kind of doing like the Jordan LeBron comparison that everyone was doing when he was younger. It's like you're comparing a guy that's further along in his career to a guy that is younger. And I think what we're also able to see this season is that these guys, Garrett Wilson, Drake London, Chris Olave, they will develop beyond what, or hopefully will develop beyond what we saw last year as rookies. And to me, I mean, we just talked about how AJ Brown might have hit his ceiling. So now we're talking about this guy who's already such a good wide receiver on that team, a tight end that's really good on that team, a running back now in there who might catch some passes, maybe
2
some,
running
not
backs if
too
you wanna
many.
throw in Rashad Penny.
I don't. I don't. I really don't. But that's why I still keep Chris Olave pretty high, man, because we saw what Derek Carr was able to do with, granted, it's Devontae Adams, but he led Devontae Adams to a top 5 wide receiver season. And Chris Olave, given the injury history of Michael Thomas and given the landscape of that roster, I think there's a real chance from a talent standpoint, from all the data and metrics we have put out there on the other episodes, that Chris Olave could still absolutely be a top 8 wide receiver when everything is all said and done. I've got as my wide receiver 10. I know that you're a bit lower on him.
Yeah, I think wide receiver 16 or 17 is where I have
You're
him.
disgusting.
Yeah, well, it's,
Yeah.
Sig talked about this a couple weeks ago, though. First of all, go check out that episode if you haven't already. We had Sigmund
Yes.
Bloom on. Fantastic episode. But, he talked about how the talent level from rounds 3 to 5, whether you're looking at running back, quarterback, wide receiver, it really does flatten out a lot. So I think a lot of these guys right now, we are splitting hairs talking about the differences between Jalen Waddle and Devonta Smith
100%.
and Chris Olave. At the end of the day, they're really, really good players. And sure, some, really what it's going to come down to at the end of the year, looking at all these guys, whoever scores the most touchdowns is probably going to have the most fantasy points because they're all very, very good players. And that touchdown luck is going to be the differentiator at the end of the year.
Let's finish out tier number 3 here, where you have some of the bigger names. These aren't like, this feels more like the guys who have done it, whereas the beginning of tier 3 feels a bit more like the hopefuls. And at the end of tier 3 here, we've got Amari Cooper at wide receiver 16, Calvin Ridley at 17, Keenan Allen at 18, Debo Samuel 19, and Terry McLaurin at 20. Uh, these have all been veterans that have been around for a minute. Calvin Ridley, missed a bit of time here. Debo Samuel has dealt with injury issues. Amari Cooper, we're hoping that Deshaun Watson is, playing like his normal self. Terry McLaurin now dealing with another not good quarterback or not elite quarterback. Like, I'm not against Sam
Poor
Howell, but
guy.
yeah, it's just year after year after year. So we look at all these players. Is there one out of this group that you perceive to have the highest floor? And then which one also to you might have the highest ceiling?
I think I've got the same answer for both, for the highest floor and the highest ceiling. Keenan Allen.
Let's hear it.
Keenan Allen, man.
Yeah, baby.
It's crazy to me. I tweeted about Keenan Allen a few days ago, and I got flooded with like the same reply from almost everybody is that he is injury prone. That's crazy to me. I mean, early
It's really not.
early on in his career, he was injured. He had a few injuries, but then if you look over a 5-year period, he missed 4 games, and then he had the hamstring last year. I see you shaking your head.
You
Do
know
you
whatever
disagree
I
with
th
me?
I No, no, he's not injury prone. He's maybe the king of being questionable, but I think what everyone remembers is the one time where we were all worried. It was like fantasy playoffs. I think this was 2
And
seasons
he
ago.
grabbed the
We were
camera
all
and said he
worried,
was gonna play.
and yeah, he's like, "I'm gonna play," and we are all worried about his hamstring, and he did play, and he was active, and I'm fairly certain it was like a 0 point or 1 point game, and everyone remembers that, and that's what happens, right? Is you mention this all the time, is that fantasy managers we have this memory of a goldfish, right? But when it comes to stuff like that,
Yeah.
when we have been hurt, we are scorned lovers, and there is hell hath no fury like a fantasy manager who feels betrayed by a player because they hold on to that forever. And you're listing it. Keenan Allen has not been injury prone. He hasn't missed time.
You remember just sorry to go completely off on a tangent here. I can't
Do it.
remember the exact year. I wanna say it was 2013 or 2014, but, nowadays, we're so lucky with, like, smartphones attached to our hip, we can make last-second changes. Do you remember?
Wait, do you have your smartphone on your hip? Do you use like one of those belt
Yeah, and it's
clips?
got a
Like it's
extender, I can, like,
1996?
zzz, and I pull it no.
You freaking dork.
But do you remember there used to be a rule where lineups would lock 10 minutes before kickoff if you were playing on
Yep.
ESPN. 2013, in the fantasy football playoffs, Reggie Bush is jogging out warming up, and he slipped on the tarp and hurt his knee after lineups had already locked, and I couldn't make the change, and, like, that is ingrained in my head. I forget if it was week 15 or week 16, but it was in the fantasy playoffs, and I lost because Reggie Bush had a pregame warm-up injury. Anyway, I completely forgot. What was the question?
We're talking about the wide receivers with the highest ceiling and highest floor. You had said Keenan Allen, and I agree with
And
you. Like I'm the same way there. I think it was what for like the final 8 weeks of the season, Keenan Allen was like the wide receiver 3 in
took
fantasy.
the words right out of my
So
mouth. Only behind
it's
Justin
not like
Jefferson
he's
and Devontae Adams. Yeah.
yeah, so it's not like he's getting old and washed up, and that's why my statement about the route runners stands. And now all of a sudden, you've got Kellen Moore coming in to take
Mhm.
over the offense, where it's going to be more pass heavy, and they've been talking about passing the ball further downfield. So now some of those easy targets for Keenan Allen, and honestly, I mean, there is something to be said for quarterbacks that get comfortable with certain players. Justin Herbert is obviously very, very comfortable with Keenan Allen, and some of these concepts, these route concepts where maybe Keenan Allen was running at 3, 4, 5 yards a pop, he might start be running these at 10, 11, 12 yards a pop. And it's going to be a little bit different. So I would not be surprised if we still see a very good season from Keenan Allen. I do want to mention, we haven't talked about him on this episode, but if you go back and you watch or listen to our episode with Graham Barfield, he gives some pretty good stats on Deebo Samuel, and he makes a case for why you should be drafting Deebo Samuel. We're not going to talk about that today, but you just got to go back to the other episode. Dave, I'm going to go a little off script here. I want to know, what is it about Calvin Ridley that has you? I think you and we're both a little bit lower on him, but I think we have both kind of bit the bullet, and we do have him ahead of Christian Kirk. What is keeping us from buying into all the hype?
Well, man, I hate to say it because like we preach like don't get overexcited by training camp clips. Like you're gonna see these clips hit
Right.
your Twitter feed. Don't overreact. But my God, have you seen what Calvin Ridley has looked
He
like
looks
out there?
so good,
Yeah,
man.
and early in the offseason, if you go back and listen to shows that I was doing in March and April and May, I was repping Christian Kirk, and I was saying Christian Kirk is still the wide receiver one here. Calvin Ridley has been 2
You're
years.
repping him
I
today.
mean, I still got the shirt.
You're
I
wearing
still got the shirt.
you're wearing a Christian Kirk shirt.
I love Christian Kirk, man. I love him. If there's one thing I love, it is just like middling wide receivers. Alan Lazard, Christian Kirk, Donovan Peoples-Jones, Sterling Shepard. You're my babies. Come here. You're always going to be
And
safe with
everybody
me.
just turned this video off.
But I was projecting Christian Kirk to be the wide receiver one, and I had some concerns. It had been almost 2 years since we saw Calvin Ridley play football. But then I tweeted about a month ago, and I said, you know what? I'm missing something here because everybody has Calvin Ridley ahead of Christian Kirk except me. So I went back and I started watching some games from 2020. And then I remembered, oh yeah, I've got a goldfish brain too. Calvin Ridley is really, really good at football. And now that we see these clips coming out of him making these spectacular one-handed catches and just dusting everybody in one-on-ones, I'm trying not to read into it too much, but I'm starting to see the appeal again. You know, I had Calvin Ridley ranked as a top 5 receiver 2 years ago. It seems kind of
Yeah.
foolish to push him down outside of my top 20 now.
He is the Football Guys consensus wide receiver 17, which I think that is rich, Dave. I think you and I both have him outside of the top 20, and I think that's appropriate. Um, so I will speak on that, as I do think that the consensus rankings of Football Guys, we can make some adjustments. But yeah, I'm not ready to put Calvin Ridley in the top 17 like that. I do still think there's plenty of risk of a player that hasn't played for quite some time. And even when he did play, he was dealing with injuries then. He's learning a whole new offense. There's a lot that goes into it. But if you're getting him at the right price, I do think that arguably he might have the best ceiling out of a lot of the players that's in this tier. I know we talked about Keenan Allen, but you know, Calvin Ridley could be that guy as well. But the floor just could be astronomically bad. We have no
Yeah,
idea.
I'd go as far as to say that until you hit Kyle Pitts in your draft, which is typically going in like the fifth or sixth turn, or like the fifth or sixth round, I think Calvin Ridley has the widest range of outcomes up until Kyle Pitts. Like if you're
Yep.
taking Calvin Ridley where he's going right now, you know that you're taking a huge risk. I mean, he could be the overall wide receiver one. He could just kind of be dust at this point and be the wide receiver 50. You don't really know what you're getting, but I think that it is worth it at the cost. I've finally come around to it.
Now we're going to keep talking about tiers 4 and 5 over on the audio version of this show. These have been tiers 1 through 3 based on the Football Guys consensus rankings. Dave and I, we're going to keep trucking along. So if you want to be a part of that and you want to hear what we have to say about these next tiers, head on over to the audio version. You'll find the link to the podcast in the description of this video, and you can check us out and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. And we're really going to analyze these mid-round values. So thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you next time.